I still remember the sound of the garden that morning, quiet. Not peaceful quiet, just still. Like something had stopped breathing. The basil was yellowed. The tomatoes were hanging limp on brittle vines, and old Mrs. Langston just stood there staring at her plot like she'd lost a friend. Most folks thought it was the drought. Or maybe a busted valve, but I knew. I knew exactly why the garden was dying. It wasn't a natural disaster. It was deliberate. And the person behind it? Susan, HOA president, clipboard queen, tyrant in pastel slacks. See, I live at the edge of a neighborhood called Willow Crest, one of those planned communities that looks like a postcard and feels like a sitcom where everyone's afraid of the HOA more than the IRS. I've been here for over 10 years, and during the last 5, we've had barely enough water to keep the grass from crunching. The city put out restrictions so tight you could get fined for washing your dog on a Tuesday. But I'm an engineer, and I don't like helpless. So, I built a rain collection system. Quietly. Legally. Just discreet. 7 tanks tucked behind a line of hedge and a high fence. They collected rooftop runoff and fed a pipeline straight down to the community garden 3 blocks away. Not everyone knew about it, not even the board. I didn't do it for credit. I just didn't want the kids from the townhouses digging through dry dirt hoping for carrots. And it worked. For 2 years. The garden thrived when everything else shriveled. We never said much about it. People assumed it was luck or some backdoor city exemption. I let them think that. The less attention, the better. But Susan doesn't like things she can't control. She's the kind of person who notices when your porch chair isn't HOA-approved beige. The kind who fines you for having overly festive wind chimes. So when she noticed that the garden looked suspiciously green during a level 4 water alert, she started sniffing around. First, she came by my place, leaned on my fence, and said, "Colin, your backyard seems unusually hydrated." Any comment? I smiled and told her it must be a lucky microclimate. She didn't buy it. A week later, I got a warning notice in the mail for unauthorized landscaping structures, which, best I could tell, meant the compost bin behind my garage. Then came the fine. Then another. I appealed. She denied it. So, I built a taller fence and minded my business. Until last Monday. I woke up early, 5:30, coffee in hand, out on the deck. And something felt off. There's a faint hum when the tanks are full, like a low heartbeat. That morning, silence. I walked the perimeter. All 7 tanks, bone dry, gauges flatlined, lock on the main valve, cut clean through. My stomach dropped. Not vandalism, not weather. This was sabotage. And in that moment, I didn't need proof. I already knew. Still, I had to be sure. I biked over to Jerry, he's 2 blocks over, keeps bees on his rooftop and cameras around his hives to keep raccoons out. His setup catches part of my yard. I asked if I could check footage from the night before. Jerry nodded, said, "If this is about Susan, I've got a bad feeling." We sat in his cluttered workshop surrounded by jars of wildflower honey and watched. There she was, 2:04 a.m., hooded jacket, bolt cutters, gloves. She slipped behind my fence, snapped the lock, twisted the valve, and stood there, watching the water drain into the gravel. Not for 5 seconds, for 5 minutes. Then she walked off like she'd just taken out the trash. That night, I didn't sleep. I just kept hearing the hiss of water draining out of my tanks and thinking about the hands that would reach into dry soil the next morning and come up empty. What kind of person drains a whole community's water just because she can't stand not being in control? This wasn't about code or violations. This was personal. And it was cruel. But I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to post angry rants. I was going to show the truth, slowly, precisely, and publicly. First, I visited the garden. It was worse than I expected. Dozens of plants shriveled overnight. The kids' sunflower patch was gone. Miss Langston's cucumber trellis had collapsed. People stood around looking confused and helpless. No one knew where the water came from. I'd never told them. But that morning, I did. I climbed onto one of the garden benches and called everyone over. My voice shook at first. I don't love being the center of attention, but I told them everything. The tanks. The piping. How it worked. How it had quietly kept this place alive. And how someone had cut the line on purpose. At first, there was silence. Then questions. Then anger. I didn't say Susan's name yet, but I said I had video. And that I planned to bring it to the next HOA meeting. The thing about people like Susan is that they think silence means fear. But sometimes silence is just waiting. By Thursday, I had copies of the footage, written statements from garden volunteers, city water permits, and even an endorsement from a local urban agriculture nonprofit. I also had a plan. I walked into that HOA meeting wearing the same flannel I'd worn the day I built the first tank. Susan was already there, sipping from a ceramic mug that said, "It's not personal, it's policy." She gave me that tight, fake smile. I gave her a nod. When they opened the floor to new business, I stood up, calmly stated my name, and said I had a matter involving potential misconduct by a board member. The room went still. Susan tried to cut me off, said I needed to file a request, but I'd come prepared. Quoted the exact bylaw she'd written that said any resident may bring forth urgent matters impacting shared community resources. She couldn't argue with her own words. So I plugged in the USB, played the footage. Gasps, murmurs. Someone actually said, "Holy hell." Then I handed out the evidence packets. Susan turned red, then white, then red again. She tried to claim she thought the tanks were leaking. I showed maintenance reports that proved otherwise. She said the tanks were illegal. I held up my city permit. She said the garden wasn't under HOA responsibility. I showed the newsletter she wrote 3 years ago inviting residents to plant their own food there. Then she said, and I quote, "I was just protecting property values." That's when Sarah Myers stood up. Original board member, retired school principal, said one sentence that ended the debate. No one wants to live in a neighborhood where kindness is punished. That was it. The board voted to suspend Susan pending investigation. The room erupted, not in chaos, but in relief. You could feel the weight lifting. But Susan didn't go quietly. No. Next morning, I got a visit from a city inspector claiming there'd been a report about illegal irrigation on my property. Same lies. Different angle. But I had every document ready. The inspector barely made it through the folder before shaking his head and muttering, "I've seen this kind of HOA war before." Turns out, Susan's sabotage wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The inspector's visit triggered a full audit. And guess what they found? An illegal pipe running from the HOA maintenance line straight into Susan's backyard. Yep, she'd been rerouting city-supplied water to keep her rose bushes alive while the rest of us used buckets. She accused me of hoarding water while secretly stealing it herself. When that came out, local news jumped on it. HOA president accused of water theft during drought. That headline went viral. The garden became a symbol. Volunteers showed up in droves. Donations rolled in. The city awarded us a grant to expand. Susan? She vanished. Resigned. Disgraced. Rumor is she's doing mandatory community service, pulling weeds in some park. Fitting. And me? I didn't run for HOA. Didn't want the title. But I helped rebuild. We added more tanks, more garden beds. Even a greenhouse made from old window frames. It became more than a patch of vegetables. It became the neighborhood's heart. A few weeks later, it finally rained. Real, soaking, rooftop drumming rain. I stood out there in it, watching the tanks fill again. And for the first time in months, I felt at peace. Funny thing, I never set out to fight a war. I just wanted to grow something that mattered. But when the fight came to me, I didn't flinch. I just stayed rooted. So now I want to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA? Would you have stayed quiet like I did, or gone public from day one? And more importantly, what do you think matters more, policy or people? Let me know in the comments. I'll be reading. February 2nd.